What's up, PvD extraordinaires? It's time for another map critique, this time, the Alpine Borderlands. I bet that inner forum warrior is saying, wow, he smashed Edge of the Mist, destroyed Desert Borderlands. Surely, Alpine Borderlands is just perfect, the absolute quintessence of every World vs. World map. Well, let's see. This is what I thought of it. Color, shape, kind of mediocre in the middle. They also are doing two things, a little bit of narrative, a little bit of gameplay. That's why both of those bell curves are sort of in the middle. You obviously see that classical little hump for the team colors and territories. However, for line, that was actually pretty good for this map, I would say. Very long and decisive, going to objective, that's great. But overall, the quality was meh, right in between. Half empty, half full, however you want to look at that. So let's delve into each one. So you want specifics. What about the color? Well, as you can see, I broke it down. Basically, the snowy parts, defenders having a height advantage, maybe a little bit around hills as well. And of course, the invaders in the grass area. And they have less of an advantage just due to height. But that's also telling a bit of a narrative or laying down the setting for this place. This is a bunch of snowy mountains, and there's some grasslands. Now, why I said it was meh, well, let's look at it. If I were to ask you, what was the narrative or the setting of this place? What's the focus? Could you actually tell me that? Like, I don't even know. Like, what is the focus? At least the Desert Borderlands, it wasn't just some desert. There was an oasis, which is essentially a focus. A natural focus, of course, but it had a focus. But here, we can see in the middle, we think there's a focus there, but it's just split between all those bloodlust. Yeah, it makes lines, that's great, but those things, those objectives, aren't actually that valuable in comparison to, say, a garrison. Or a keep over here. Or a keep over here. And yet we have all these things pointing to the center, but really it's a muddled mess. Especially color-wise. You have a tan here, some green over here, some grayish, darkish colors over here. I mean, I don't know what's going on. If I zoom back out, I actually see some dark spots over here that shouldn't be in focus because there's nothing over there but centaurs. So say color in this sense isn't very good at indicating either narrative focus or even gameplay focus, except for maybe in the bay here. So let's move on to the next one. So why was the shapes also kind of like 50% kind of meh? Well, I'll go to it straight away. So obviously we have our rectangle here for the big shape of the map. Now I believe that actually causes issues because you can see these X's that I put up here. Waste of space. Nothing really happens or benefits World vs. World. We saw that in Desert Borderland, but the problem with Desert Borderland, they actually put a tower in this. In this case, Alpine avoided that disaster and moved the towers down here. Okay, cool. So the box was a bad idea. What about some of the bigger shapes? Well, the bigger shapes actually do a fair job of splitting up regions and zones organically, as you can see down here. And of course, up here, the big shape for the defender's side is that cold cliff. And as far as objectives go, the shapes were actually fairly decent. Like, there's a lot of geometric sort of towers with a little circle for the tower bit. The keeps are clearly identifiable. There's this little organic rectangle for the bay area. Nice little strong rectangle for the keep with a little circle. Same with garrison, clearly identified through the shapes. But even in the center, while it is a muddled mess overall, there are some nice shapes that provide strategical benefit, such as there and there. The other two shapes, not as significant, they're just bloodlust. They don't provide any unique advantage whatsoever. Overall, the shapes, they do a decent job, but my issue is there's this huge waste of space up at the top once again. Okay, so line. How did I break down the line and why was it so good? Well, let's check it out. Since I said it was leaning towards more gameplay, what I meant there is there's these long, decisive, uninterrupted pathways to objective. There's very few short little lines that would actually be more for narrative's sake. The only time that actually happens is the muddled mess I keep referring to down in the center here. This doesn't say all small lines are bad. As we saw in Desert Borderland, a lot of its small lines were actually near keeps and stuff. And yeah, there are some inside lines of the keep, but for Desert Borderland, they're actually on the outside of keep as you were getting closer and closer. And what that did was offer some contrast. But here, there's a lot of strong, long lines with the occasional zigzag on the sides here. Otherwise, I say overall, the lines for this map are fairly solid. So, where should we be? Well, as I stated in a previous video, I think we should be somewhere in between when it comes to world versus world maps. But for this particular map, it averages about to be right about here, a little bit of a bump for the teams and territories. But overall, it's not very strong. It's like, once again, we end up with a 50% cup half full or half empty, however you want to look at that. And let's move on to the next step. Fabulous! So, step 2, map mechanics. Here we go. Sentries that mark enemies on the map, Doliacs that deliver supply camps that spawn those Doliacs and generate their own supply, gates, walls, towers that usually have one layer of gates and walls, keeps that have 2 layers of gates or walls, defensive siege on objectives, a bad use of a jumping puzzle, a good use of a jumping puzzle that provides defensive strategical use, or possibly a launching point for gliding, a tiered upgrade system for most objectives, Tactivators that use the active guild upgrades on objective. There are also passive guild upgrades that affect the given territory for each objective. Gliding within your territory. Bloodlust that can provide global stat benefits if you hold more than 3. So in comparison to the previous 2 maps we looked at, I think that's a much more manageable list of game mechanics. Now that we have a little more time, I can actually talk about the relationships between objectives. And no, I'm not talking about romantic ones. Alright, so how did I break those relationships down? Well, there's either no relationships like up here with the supply camp. There are single-sided relationships like here. And what I mean by this, can siege actually damage the objective? In this case, it's a supply camp. It has no walls, so sieging it doesn't really matter as much, but you can kill the siege that is sieging you. In a two-sided relationship, you can have a Treb hit Garrison, and a Treb from Garrison can hit the wall there. Such as this relationship with this tower and Garrison as well. Also, from less necessary objectives, say Bloodlust, you can siege towers like Green Lake. Again, while this was a muddled mess, whoever created the terrain for this area and for this little rune here actually did a good job, because they're giving a strategic advantage, but it's also a vulnerable area that's not surrounded by destructible walls or gates. Now for Bay, being the most vulnerable, you can actually treb from this particular camp down in Redvale into Inner and Outer. Honestly, I think this is a issue. It does offset the balance on this map, meaning Bay is now more vulnerable in comparison to Hills, and that's basically been the way since the initial release of this map. So what about those lonely little supply camps with no one to siege at? Well, because they're supply camps, Doliacs go to each objective. So really they have a relationship, it's just not one of siege. And same with the south one. The Doliacs go to each objective. Although for the south, you can actually start up your little siege on this island and hit this tower. Although you can't actually do that for the other tower, it's too far away. Keeping with objectives, there's something we really need to mention with the new territories that have been introduced. Particularly with the center area. I don't have any issue with the other areas, but Bloodlust nodes decap themselves. This is an issue, because if you're gliding and the thing suddenly decaps himself, like say from Garrison, you end up falling down and dying, and have to do that all over again. If it was your Bloodlust, it's fine, but again, eventually it decaps itself. And that's where I really take issue of adding mechanics later to a map that hasn't really been created for such mechanics, particularly for this territory stuff that's been added, and some gliding that we'll definitely see in EBG. Alright, enough of that. We're done. We're through. Let's move on to step 3, Sightlines. Okay, let's start with spawn points. Starting out here, at least you're on the tutorial person, but really I see this giant portal to my right. And why do I have to focus on that? I don't know. That tells me I should leave again, and I don't think that's the message you want to send. Moving on from that, I can clearly see ahead that I have 3 options. This way, I don't really see a whole lot. There's actually a lack of world beyond out in that water to the right. Not very exciting at all. From here, I think I can see the Orchid where the supply camp is. There's also a vista over there. Let's check a different route this time. Going forward. Center route, I can see the tower in the distance. Next way. I can see where the supply camp is with the buildings. There's this rock in the way, but that's fine, it's natural. So passing through that supply camp, a bunch of other objectives are clearly visible. So passing through the tower, we actually see some people are making use of the Coliseum terrain over there. Of course, the same punk kids killed our trebs that were hitting Bay, but oh well. And moving on to the other side. And we actually see that same tower and Bloodlust point relationship where they can siege from the top of those ruins over there onto the tower. Mostly the same story for the bottom right spawn. We see kind of a poor angle on some portals. At least we're standing on tutorial guy. Otherwise, the other pathways are roughly the same story as far as visibility of other objectives go. Oh boy, top spawn. I was gonna sing the praises, but again, these portals are in the way. Otherwise, I would have had a nice shot of all 3 pathways, those 3 arches. They really should have just shoved them back there somewhere like the other portal, but hey, nitpicky stuff. Let's go ahead and move on out. Whoa, we can see our tower. Great, super, moving on. Our camp is clearly visible. There's even a nice little arches that guide us. This tower is slightly off path, but you can glide inside now in case you need to defend it, just like the other tower. Now, here's where I start getting my attention elsewhere. I can see in the distance there's this smokestack, and really, that's like an irrelevant place. There's just a bunch of Centaur NPCs. There's absolutely little benefit to going over there, but a lot of detail was actually put back here, and honestly, a lot of that is wasted. So great, I can kill some Centaurs and stop an attack that never was any threat whatsoever. Yeah. I would say most of the other sightlines pretty much follow all the little objective relationships we set out earlier. So I can probably show you all that footage, but we won't really learn all that much. So let's get into the conclusion here. So the first thing, the art. It's not so much just graphical fidelity or anything like that I'm worried about. It's really the direction here. In short, there isn't a lot of direction. You set out the setting, a bunch of snowy mountains and some greenlands, but there's no relative focus. Like the runes are there, but it's a big mess in the center there. However, I will say for the line, even first person mode, looking at it, the pathways, the trails are actually clearly visible even while I'm fighting this random fight near this tower. In an abrupt transition to game mechanics, I can't stress the importance of objectives having relationships with one another. Otherwise we end up with issues like the desert borderland and the towers that I mentioned previously. They're all essentially daisy-chained together by either siege or Doliacs and giving supply. Having objectives tied together creates conflict and an ebb and flow to a certain map. when this is gone, we end up drying out that conflict and not a lot happens around such things as the Centaur camp, the Scrit camp, or even that jumping puzzle that's all the way to the left. So similar to the Desert Borderlands, it seems the top part of this map has issues of being unused and inactive. And I do have a theory on this. That's something I'm going to keep for the final conclusion video of this whole mini-series. If you want to hear more about this, you can subscribe, be updated on the next videos, hit that like button if you liked it, hit that dislike button if you disliked it, leave a comment below. I really do need the help, and let me know if you have any suggestions. Otherwise, I will see you next time.